Welcome to Sexual Health with Sharon, a podcast about all topics related to your sexual health. No topic goes uncovered or is too taboo to discuss. My philosophy is that your sexual health is part of your general health. So this is a sex-positive space where we explore how sexual, mental, physical, and spiritual health all contribute to your overall health and well-being. I'm Sharon Wyndham. I'm a sexual health coach who helps you create more intimacy and connection with yourself and your partner or partners. If you're ready to embrace and nurture your sexuality, discover your erotic identity, increase your sexual self-esteem, and achieve a more fulfilling sex life, and really just get in tune with your sexual health, then you're in the right place. So welcome, and let's get started with today's episode. On today's episode, we talk about out-of-control sexual behavior with Doug Braun-Harvey. Doug is a sexual health psychotherapist, author, and trainer. He has developed and implemented a sexual health-based treatment approach for men with out-of-control sexual behavior. We discuss his work over the last 30 years, his 6 principles to sexual health, and rethinking the sex addiction model. Well, I am super excited to welcome my very first special guest to my very first podcast episode, a person who I consider now a friend and definitely a mentor in the sexual health field, Doug Braun-Harvey. Welcome.
Sharon, I just found out 2 minutes ago this was your first podcast, and I've been invited to be your first guest, and I'm honored.
Yes.
And so looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Yes. Well, I think so highly of you, and I couldn't have thought of a better person to be my first. And I'm just excited for that. So,
well, we know a lot of people can't say that about their first. That they were excited and couldn't wait for that person to be their first.
How appropriate, right? So
there's benefits to aging.
Yeah. For sure. And Darwin, is it all right if I introduce you as well?
Of course.
Okay. So, and I've got my life partner and friend, Darwin Ruiz, who he is in the medical exercise field, and he is joining us today to speak about sexual health, an important sexual health topic, out of control sexual behavior.
From the layman's perspective.
From the layman's perspective, yes. And just really be a support to me as well. So welcome both of you, and thank you so much for your time and shared input and insight on this very, very important and controversial topic too. I'm going to do a quick introduction about Doug. So Doug is a licensed marriage and family therapist. He is a certified sex therapist and a certified sex therapy supervisor. He is also a sexual health author and trainer, focusing on bridging sexual health and mental health. He has been developing and implementing a sexual health-based treatment approach for men with out-of-control sexual behavior over the last 30 years. His book, Treating Out-of-Control Sexual Behavior, Rethinking Sex Addiction, co-authored with Michael Vigorito, was published in 2015 and is available on Amazon, which is how I found him. In 2013, Doug and his husband and partner, Al Harvey, co-founded the Harvey Institute, which is an international education, training, consulting, and supervision service for improving healthcare through integration of sexual health. So how did I do with that?
Thank you so much.
Sure. I'm super excited because how we met, I'll just give a brief introduction on how we met. We met during my internship at the Montrose Center here in Houston, Texas. And I was very fortunate as an intern to participate in this amazing training that Doug provided for us on sexual health and recovery as part of my training with the intensive outpatient treatment program for substance use. I apologize.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very thorough training, and I loved it so much that when I'm also on the board for the Houston Association for Marriage and Family Therapy as the director of ethics and diversity. And of course, I will always bring the sexual health lens wherever I possibly can. And I couldn't have thought of a better person to invite over to speak about this topic to our members of therapists, marriage and family therapists on the topic. And it was a very successful and enlightening and enriching training, and received wonderful feedback, and I'm so grateful. So I just developed a crush on Doug after that, and keep inviting him back. So here we are.
I love being someone that somebody can still have a crush with.
Yes.
Thank you for saying that, Sharon.
Yes. So we'll just dive right in. I think the first thing, since we're both of us, and you know, given the time you've spent with your work, the focus is really on sexual health. If you can share a little bit about what the definition of sexual health is to you.
Well, you know, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, sexual health is an evolving idea. It's not that long ago that sexual health pretty much meant don't have an unplanned or unwanted pregnancy and don't get a sexually transmitted infection. I mean, that was kind of it. So, you know, it's only been in the last 40 or maybe 50 years, which isn't that long of a period of time, as long as human beings have been sexual, that the World Health Organization and other international and national bodies have begun to think about there's got to be more to sexual health than just don't get knocked up and don't get the clap. And that's really what has evolved. That sexual health is so much more than just preventing or avoiding a negative sexual outcome of sexual behavior. And that's pretty much what sexual health was until the last 50 years. You just avoided something negative, and I guess that meant you had health. But health is not the absence of a problem. Health is a destination. Health is a place you can envision and actually go to. And so for the last 40 years or more, we finally have some parameters to envision, you know, what is sexual health? What does that destination look like? And the World Health Organization and other bodies have sort of come up with what I kind of reduced down to a very simple kind of idea, that sexual health is this balancing between the safety components of sexuality. If we're going to have sex, we have to be involved in some sort of parameters of safety. We don't want to harm people. We don't want to harm others. You know, there are consequences we want to prevent from happening. So that's the safety dimension of sex. And we tend to be better about talking about the safety dimensions of sex, the things we want to prevent from happening, the risks, the harm. We tend to be better and more comfortable with those conversations. But sexual health is the balancing. Think of it as like a balance beam, an art form of the balance between the safety aspects of sex and the pleasurable aspects of sex. So sexual health, if you're going to really focus on sexual health, pleasure has to have as equitable of a role in the conversation as safety and concern for risk and harm and protection of other people. So sexual health is this balance of safety and pleasure. And typically why sexual health is such an important topic to talk about is it's the pleasure component of sexual health that most people have discomfort, lack of literacy, lack of familiarity, and either shame or even disgust to discuss what might be pleasurable about one's sexual life.
And I agree. The pleasure component is, I mean, that's the difficult part. That's the challenging part. But one thing I remember from the training is that in addition to that definition, is ensuring ensuring sexual sexual rights. So
yes, I'll speak more of that. Thank you for that. You're right. The next development, once this idea came around that we have to include pleasure and safety together, the next incarnation and development of definitions of sexual health was that there are human rights associated with sexual health, and there are 16 rights associated with sexual health. You can go to the World Association of Sexual Health website and type in sexual rights, and you'll see all 16 of them. But I'll just give you an example of what I mean by sexual rights, because it's sort of a vague idea for people to kind of, what is that anyway? Well, one sexual right is the right to medically and scientifically accurate information about sex. Now, isn't it odd that we actually have to list as a right around sexual health on the planet, that you have a right to getting accurate information?
Yes.
Now, when it comes to math, we all have agreed 2 + 2 = 4. We don't like make it a human right. Like, well, at least some people think it's 5. We've all agreed on this. But sexual health, we have no agreement. There's real little consensus on the planet anywhere about, scientific knowledge, information about sexuality, what is viable information to know, what's accurate information to know. So, for example, in the United States, I don't know if people are aware of this, but in the United States, sex education is funded by the federal government in all 50 states, but the federal government does not require the states to spend the money the federal government gives them for sex education. They don't require the states to spend money on medically and scientifically accurate sex education. The states can educate on whatever they want.
I think we learned this recently. Remember?
Yes. Yes, we
we
did.
heard this somewhere, and it blew my mind.
Right. So we actually have less than a third. It's maybe like a quarter. I'm not what the percentage is now, of states in the United States that their state legislatures actually have to pass a law that says sex education that's funded by the federal government in our state must be medically and scientifically accurate. So those are called medical accuracy laws for sex education. And so if any listener is listening to this, you might want to research if your state is a medically accurate state when it comes to sex education. Now, the state you're in Texas, is a non-medical accuracy state. I'm in California, which is a medical accuracy state. So here's an example. In Texas, you could teach everybody in a sex education course in the state of Texas, elementary through high school, that to have attractions to somebody of the same sex and to desire somebody of the same sex is a mental illness. And that could be taught. And nobody's there's nothing in the law, nothing in the funding. Oh, you're going to lose your funding if you say that.
Right.
That's not the case. But in California, if you were to try to teach that, you'd lose your funding and the state would no longer let you pay to do sex education. So you can see the power of this medical accuracy law is very important.
Yes.
So that's an example of sexual rights and how sexual rights live in the policy of the country or the jurisdiction in which you live.
Yeah. And I'll, this is where, and we'll speak about this more in a little bit, where language matters. So I even, part of my, part of what I take issue with is because there's such controversy, especially here in Texas and in some other conservative states where how they view sex education, I like to incorporate the word health in there, where it's not just sex education, right? Because sex, they think of one thing, there's one lens of that, right? And if we come from a lens of health, it's sexual health education, then that to me also can change the perspective on what is being taught, what is being learned, and then just the information that's being provided all together. So when
I really want to support that, Sharon.
Yeah.
You're saying something that I have found anecdotally and is supported by people who look at this. There is a visceral reaction people can have in their bodies when it's sex, when the word is sex, and it's not, and nothing else is added to it. And when we studied what people imagine in their mind when they hear the word sex, one of the primary responses people have is they think you're thinking about which body part they put in which orifice with whom, when, and how often.
Right.
And that's all they think you're thinking about.
Right.
And so when you add sexual and then health to the phrase, that imagery, that idea, those thoughts almost disappear. And so there's a curiosity, there's an openness, there's an interest, less defendedness when the phrase is sexual health rather than sex.
Absolutely.
So I really applaud you for consciously putting those words into the discussion.
Because that's what it is, right? It's sexual health education. That's what it is. It's not just one thing. So we're talking about relationships. We're talking about self-esteem. We're talking about our bodies. We're talking, all of the above. So even just the word masturbation, right? Masturbation has such a negative connotation, and it's very disheartening to me that how there's this almost like that it's considered as, sinful to touch your own body, right? And so I don't use the word masturbation. I use the word self-pleasure or self-love, right? Because that's in essence what you're doing. You're treating yourself with that instead of seeking it from others. And especially when, for kids that are going through puberty or just, learning about their sexuality or discovering their sexuality, how important to me, what an important component of their development and self-discovery is learning about their own body. And that key component for me is what's missed in the sexual health aspect when teaching sexual health education or sex education here in Texas for sure. So
yeah, I it's a good example, Sharon, of just one word can just literally in someone's body, they have a somatic activated sensation, and their body literally has this feeling state. Now, you use the word negative connotation. I like to think that when people hear the masturbation, what's really happening is their body is having a visceral reaction, and they think that feeling response means masturbation is negative. Right. But what that feeling response is their body is just kind of conveying to them the conflicted, multiple feelings they have about this pleasurable activity we can call solo sex. And so it's as if they think the negative part is masturbation, when I believe what they're calling a negative reaction is they're having feelings that are uncomfortable or shameful or nervous or whatever, and it's those feelings that I think the word masturbation just elicits so quickly.
Yes, just and we can list all the things that elicit that same feeling, right? Those same feelings. So any sexual activity or sexual act that doesn't fall in line with your beliefs around sexuality. So when I took the training from you, we learned about the 6 principles to sexual health that you kind of is grounded on your work. So if you can share a little bit about that and elaborate.
Well, one of the things about sexual health is it can seem kind of vague and like big and like, what is that, right? So I think one of the things, another definition of sexual health that came from the Pan American Health Organization in the year 2000, had a little bit of a different wording than the World Health Organization up to that point it had. And when I looked at this kind of paragraph of the overall definition of the Pan American Health Association of Sexual Health definition, I saw 6 ideas in the definition that when I looked at them, I thought, those are the basics. You got to have these 6, kind of organized well in your mind before you can kind of go to the next level of understanding your sexual health and envisioning your life with sexual health. It's sort of like these are fundamentals. And so that was for me, that's what was missing about discussions around sexual health. It was these generalized large ideas that seemed to be presented as an all or none package, like you got to have all of this in order to have sexual health. And to me, that just doesn't seem like a very accurate way that sexual health works. There are some pretty basic things when it comes to sexual health. Let's start there and feel good about succeeding well with these 6. And then we'll go to higher levels of sophistication or knowledge or complexity. So these are the 6 that's why I call them 6 principles of sexual health. They're your absolute fundamental starting point. Now, I want you to listen to these words and notice how it's hard to tell they're about sex. Because the first one's consent. That's a pretty that's a pretty basic human interaction, right? That's consent. And then the next one's non-exploitation. That we don't want to use a power differential to take advantage of another person to get something we want through coercion, or fear, or exploitive, kind of interaction. And the next one is prevention of or protection from and this is where we now know about sex, protection or prevention of an unwanted or unplanned pregnancy, a sexually transmitted infection, or HIV. So, we want to either prevent or protect others from having, these experiences happen. Now, this is typically what we thought sexual health was. Just don't have an unplanned pregnancy and don't get an STI, and you're kind of good to go. So it's still one of the fundamentals, but it's one of six, right? And the next one is the next two are actually fairly subjective. So we've got honesty and shared values. So, honesty is kind of a cool thing in relationships. We like to think of honesty as an important, experience we have with each other. And then what are our values? What's important to us? What's the meaning of our sexual life, of our sexual pleasure, of our sexual thoughts, of the way we relate to and imagine how we want to be sexually with other people? These are all things we have values or attitudes or ethics related to it. So, those are important. And then the last one is pleasure.
Go figure.
A fun. Yes, thank you. I always list pleasure last because people are going, "Oh my God, when is he going to get to that?"
Right.
But I like to list the 5 first because you can see how many safety and ethical dimensions there are to sexual life. It's very true. 5 of the 6 have a lot of ethical and very basic human interaction dimensions to them, but it's balanced with pleasure. Just because pleasure is number 6 doesn't mean those 5 are more weighted. No, That's how important pleasure is. It's that fundamental.
Right. Yes.
And so those are the 6 principles or fundamental principles of sexual health. And so inviting people to just think about what has been your experience in life with sexual consent or non-consent? What has been your experience in life with sexual exploitation or non-exploitation? What's been your experience with honesty in sexuality, or, maybe your own failures of being honest in the way you wanted to be, or others. So these are ideas that, notice how you can talk about these things with, I don't think, having that somatic activation as much, like when you say the word masturbation, because none of these principles are about a sex act.
Right.
They don't describe a sex act that people are going to, have reactions to, a specific, sexual activity or way people are sexual. So the principles kind of settle down people's nervousness in talking about sexual health.
Well, I got a visual when you were listing, when you were naming the 6 principles, and for me, there was some symbolism there for me. I found it interesting that the first one was consent, and then the last one was pleasure. And I got the visual of your definition of the definition you gave for sexual health as the balance between safety, consent, right, and everything between, and pleasure and sexual pleasure. And I have it's unfortunate I don't have the diagram that you present in your training, that artistic diagram of the 2 people on top of a couple of
the key thing, Sharon, is those are 2 nude people.
Yes.
Balancing each other and forming the letter T with their legs going straight out from their torsos and only their arms holding them up. And that's my picture for balancing safety and pleasure. And exactly where their hands are on the floor is I have the word sexual right.
Yes. I mean, it's so impactful, that image. So as you were listing that, that's what flooded my brain. And I saw that balance between consent and pleasure and everything in between. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
But Sharon, you're also reminding our listeners, look at how compelling that is for you, just to have an image that found a way to be welcomed and remain in your mind that kind of anchors this concept beyond words.
Yeah.
And I think this is helpful when it comes to sexual health. Do we have some ways of our mind creating images and pictures or narratives that are evocative and help us with our sexual health rather than be about fear? And so what I love about that being the image you remembered was that it's an image that was helpful and supportive, not an image of fear or worry or punishment.
Yeah, it's what's always stuck with me with my definition of sexual health. So that to me just, it ties it all. It just kind of brought it all together for me. So yes, I love sharing that.
And I imagine that these beliefs and these fears that you're talking about, these feelings people have, are a result of, maybe how your parents talk to you about sex. Or for myself, I grew up Catholic, so there was a whole lot of stuff around that topic as well. So I think it sounds like what you're saying is on one level, you have to sort of look at where those feelings are coming from.
So Darwin, let me ask you then, because you used a word called stuff. Now, when I hear words like that around sex, I want to know what stuff means. So
Well,
when you told us stuff, what were you actually wanting us to know, this stuff?
well, the stuff is sort of the shame around it, the idea of sin, the idea that somebody above is watching you, right? And so if you think certain things or you do certain things, so that kind of stuff.
Well, see, I so appreciate that. You see, you knew that. All I had to do was ask you, and you did a beautiful job, right?
Thank you.
Shame and sin and being monitored.
Right.
It was kind of the word that came to my mind. And so the reason I did that, Darwin, is I wanted to show for our listeners, if you just listen to her sentence and watch and listen how a person uses kind of this kind of vague reference to something, right? I think people know what they want to say if you just ask them. So I didn't settle for stuff.
Right.
And you reinforced this notion I have, which, if people who've known me long enough, they know I do this all the time. When somebody uses a vague or unclear word, I say, well, what does that word mean? But the reason I ask is because most of the time when I ask, people say wise, informed, and clear things. And you just did. Shame, sin, and being monitored. What a great list of things that would inhibit and create all sorts of problems with, these feeling states. So that was terrific.
Good job.
Thank you.
And in particular, Darwin, I assume you're maybe a male-identified person.
Yes.
In the world I live in, I worked with men in therapy for 30 years. I was primarily cis men of all orientations, but almost all the men I worked with were identified as cisgendered men. And I find men in particular are underestimated in their ability to just be clear and informed about something they want to say. It's just that men aren't asked. It's like, it's good enough for a guy to say stuff.
Right. That's right. A good point.
And I think men are capable of so much more when you ask them.
Well, what a good segue, actually, to the next question that I had, which is, what got you into this work? How did you get into sexual health and writing about out of control sexual behavior and all of the?
Well, it was. I give my hats off to the San Diego Police Department, Vice Department, because in the late 1980s, this is how old I am. The audience may be listening to my voice. Yes, I'm that old. The late 1980s, early 90s. The San Diego Police Department, their underground vice operation, was targeting spots where men would go to have anonymous sex with other partners in public places. And what they were doing was they would do entrapment, where they would have the most handsome guy on the entire the police department, dress them quite seductively in street clothes, and then go to these locations. And the minute a man in any way touched the underground police officer in a way that violated city ordinance, the underground officer immediately pulled out their badge. 5 other officers come out of hiding, and they would arrest them for public sex. And not only that, would they get arrested for public sex? This was so shameful, so incredibly shameful. And again, remember, the era when this was happening is when gay people were some of the most vilified people in the country because of HIV and AIDS. So I mean, there was all of that. And so what happened is they would plead guilty. They would never say not guilty because they just wanted to get this over with. So they go to court, plead guilty, get sentenced, and the judge would almost always sentence them to a court-ordered sex addiction treatment program. And that's the way it was. That's the way the court ordered listed. You need to go to a sex addiction treatment group. And so there was these therapists in town that were doing court-ordered sex addiction therapy. But in these groups were sex offenders, people who were predators and had serious, harmful sexual acts of violence. And here's somebody who's having, public sex, and they're in the same group, and they're all quartered to the same treatment. So what happened is these gay identified men were going to these groups and terrified that they would be, their physical safety would be at threat for being known they were gay in these groups. So they passed it straight, and they talked about what they did, but they always referred to what happened with a woman, not a man. And they did that for their own personal safety. And so after going through this horrible experience, they'd show up at my office, traumatized.
Imagine that. Oh.
And but the question in the room that got my interest, is all of what we're worried about here this shaming consequence for public sex, or are some of these men I'm talking to, maybe there's a little bit about their sexual life that's maybe not very well regulated? And how do we know the difference?
Right.
And so I asked the San Diego Municipal Court if my therapy could be also a sex addiction treatment place for these guys to go. And they approved it. So now these guys who got arrested for public sex could be court ordered to my office for private therapy rather than have to go to these groups where they felt they were in danger. And that's how I started meeting men that I began to eventually see maybe needed a little more help than just somebody who happened to get entrapped. And it was through that social justice kind of experience of the humiliation and disgusting things these men had to go through that I became motivated to work with this population, and I had for 30 years ever since.
Incredible. What a great story. How one event can change the trajectory of your career.
Now you use the term sex addiction, but my understanding is that that's kind of that term is
I'm taking you back. I'm taking you back to the 80s and the 90s, because back then that was the only work. That was it.
Right. But now it's what your work is out of control sexual behavior, which is a different kind of perspective.
And actually, what I could say is that these men that I met in the 90s, both of all orientations, not just gay men, because heterosexual men can also be having sex with men in public places and get entrapped. It's not just gay men that do this. What I found was that men paid a very high price to get into a room where they could talk openly and honestly about some aspects of their sexual life they were concerned about. And so that's where I really felt such empathy for these men. Look what they've had to go through just to sit and talk with me.
Right.
What a price our society pays for men to have access to what I call sexual health conversation. That's a huge price. And the other price of admission has been to call yourself a sex addict. There's kind of three ways in which I see men typically get access to an informed conversation about sexuality as adult men. And that is, they have to be a sex offender and get arrested and go to sex offender treatment. They have to have been sexually abused and might be going through some sort of treatment for their sexual abuse, or they have to be labeled as a sex addict. If a man doesn't fall in one of those three categories, they're kind of out of luck. I don't know, where do they go? Who's interested in their sexual health? Who's even interested in the concerns they might have about their sexual lives? Who is?
And then we wonder why they don't seek support, right? Themselves.
Well, the problem is when they I'll get to the word act out in just a minute, because that's a real activating word. But what I have more empathy for is men don't go because when men have gone, they've been met with ignorance, or they've been met with biases. Men get called sex addicts very quickly in many of these situations. They get labeled very quickly. I call it the mental health field suffers from premature evaluation, and they just jump to these labels almost like like a knee-jerk reaction. And I think that's why men are ill-served and don't go and talk, because too many men are reacted to and given language. And Darwin, that's why the word acting out, that is an allegation that is leveled at men all the time. That their sexual activity is labeled as acting out, which the history of that word is an unconscious, misdirected behavior that causes harm to oneself or another person and is psychologically uninformed and comes from immature drives. That's not exactly a great thing to talk about when it comes to your sexual life. I mean, who wants to have that as the starting point to try to talk about what you're doing sexually? So I never use the word acting out. I rid it from my practice quite early on because I saw it as a way for men to shame themselves.
So I think when Sharon and I were talking about all of this, in the days leading to this, my question to her was, well, so what exactly is out of control behavior? In other words, I guess maybe that's when I say acting out, I guess the term out of control is that I'm kind of doing this, but I'm not sort of, it's like a compulsion, I guess. So I'd be curious to kind of get your take on what that exactly means.
Darwin, notice how difficult our language is there, because when we then start talking about it, we want to harness or attach a label to it. I guess it's a compulsion.
Right.
I guess it's this, or I guess it's that. Right. We want to make a conclusion.
Right.
In order to even talk about it. So my definition, and the one Michael Vigorito and I wrote and presented in our book of out of control sexual behavior, is first of all, out of control sexual behavior is a sexual health problem. It's not a disease, it's not a disorder, it's a sexual health problem in which a person's consensual sexual urges, thoughts, or behaviors feel out of control. This is a self experience. I feel out of control. It's not you're out of control. Somebody outside of you fixes that narrative. The person themselves says, I am feeling out of control. It's subjective. It's a state that has to be explored and understood. But that's what I mean by out of control sexual behavior. And so it's non-diagnostic. It only involves consensual sexual behavior. Out of control sexual behavior does not at all, the way I'm going to talk and relate to here, has nothing to do with the whole spectrum of predatory behavior and victimizing other people through sex crimes or non-consensual kind of activity. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about two adults who are engaged in sexual activity consensually. That for whatever reason, one or both of the adults in this situation feel out of control with that particular or many of those parts of their sexual lives. And it could be their urges, thoughts, behaviors, or any or all three.
And that's what I was hoping that you would elaborate on, the consensual sexual urges part, so that listeners can have that understanding.
All we're interested in these sexual thoughts, these sexual urges, these sexual behaviors that are consensual. Does the person themselves, for whatever reason, it doesn't matter, they feel out of control.
Yes.
And we don't have to attach a threshold to that. We don't have to attach a diagnostic, number. It's just somebody says, you know what, I'm feeling out of control. And one of the primary sources we're discovering that people really identify as a source for feeling sexually out of control is their sexual life is in conflict with their religious life.
Yes. That's huge here in Texas.
Right. Well, it's huge anywhere where people have strong religious, high demand religions, or they're very active in their faith system. Anytime people have a relationship with their religion, and religion traditionally throughout history have had very clear, specific ideas of what is redeeming sex and what is unredeeming sex. Religion makes no bones about it. They state it. And most religions have no doubt about what they believe is acceptable sex and what is not. This is one of the things religion has kind of taken ownership of when it comes to human behavior and ethical, spiritual dimensions of humanity. So you can imagine then when somebody's very, involved in their religion, or their religion demands a lot of them, really demands a lot of them, and then their sexual life conflicts with those high demands of the religion. Now, where do you go talk about that?
Well, and it brings me to the next point, as far as, especially when you talk about sexual and erotic conflicts, and attachment related avoidance, and when it comes to religion, how that could cause so much distress. What would otherwise might be a normal way of feeling and being.
Well, Sharon, I want to back up because you introduced three ideas that I think that were great to bring into the conversation, but I just want to slow down so the listener understands why you said those things. You said the word around conflict, you talked about attachment and relationships, and you talked about regulation. These are the three areas of human behavior that the research shows over and over and over again. And I'm going to speak about men here because most of all this research is with this identified men. Is these are the three areas the sex research and the research shows over and over again. These are the three areas of significant conflict in men's lives that make them feel sexually out of control. One is they're not regulating their sexual behavior very well. You know, they're just not, you know, think about regulation, right? You know, we all have to regulate things, you know, like I'm not going to belch in the middle of a movie theater. I might have to regulate my body so I don't, you know, make this sound. I mean, this is living. We do this all the time. But for some people with their sexual life, they don't feel like they can make those same regulatory kind of choices and regulate themselves effectively. So that's partly why they feel out of control. Other people feel out of control from an attachment or relationship perspective. Well, what I call is they break their relationship agreement. They make an agreement with somebody, you know, I'll only have sex with you, and then they don't keep that agreement. But here's the rub. They don't negotiate not keeping that agreement. They make a unilateral decision, all on their own, away from their partner, that I'm not going to keep this agreement anymore. And then they spend a great deal of energy making sure their partner believes they're keeping the agreement. That takes a lot of energy. And when somebody's involved in that kind of stuff, they feel kind of out of control.
Well, then that brings up the point of having an affair, or, you know.
Just try this out, Sharon, just for fun. When they don't keep their sexual relationship agreement.
Yes, thank you.
That's really all they're doing.
That's all.
They just don't keep. That's all they're doing. They just don't keep an agreement.
Right. I don't like the word cheating. Right. So when they don't keep.
Well, who does?
Yes, but no, the way you said it so much, it makes, you know, it.
Here's I think what you're asking.
There's more understanding.
It's a way to talk about a human behavior without judging it.
Yes.
You're describing it without judging it. It's cheating, an affair, that's an evaluative opinion and an evaluation and a conclusion. Oh, you had an affair. That's a conclusion. What happened was they made an agreement and they didn't keep it, and they kept it, and then they tried to make sure the person thought they were keeping it. That's what they were doing.
Yes. But I appreciate you bringing that point, because that's exactly what it is. And I think it's easier to digest as well when you say it that way. When you just break the agreement between two consensual adults.
Right.
It reminds me of nonviolent communication.
Yes.
Marshall Rosenberg.
Darren, tell us about that. What do you know about nonviolent communication that you're thinking of that right now?
So because in nonviolent communication, the idea is that so if you have a conflict with someone and you want to resolve that conflict, you first express what you've observed. And part of that observation is that there's no judgment. So I don't say, if Sharon was late to a dinner date we were having, I wouldn't say, well, you let me down, right? Instead of saying, well, we agreed, just as you were saying, we had an agreement and you didn't uphold your end of the agreement. So speaking in that way, where you're just speaking about what you observed and eliminating those judgmental words, like you were saying.
Right. And so what's it like for you to see another area of knowledge you have, just be completely relevant to this conversation about sexual health? That part of sexual health is to try to engage in nonviolent communication as the starting point for discussion. And so this is why I addressed your word acting out. This is why I addressed Sharon's word of affairs, and because those don't welcome that space that you've learned is important in nonviolent communication as an important space to start.
Mm-hmm. And this is why language matters, and this is why education around language is so important, so that we just we have that shift in how we even communicate. These areas of the conversation, right? So changing from saying affair or cheating and just saying a sexual agreement between two people, three people, whatever, however, the party, the individuals together, the partners. Yeah. So it's I love that.
And isn't it a good sign? I'm really reassured in the goodness of people when they don't keep their agreements and they suffer.
Yes.
That's kind of encouraging to me, that a person is not keeping their agreements and their life isn't quite so great. I kind of find solace in this.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
So if a man walks into me and says, I'm feeling kind of out of control, and they haven't been keeping their relationship agreements, part of me goes like, oh, you're in reality. This is good news. We've got something to work with here.
Right. Oh, wow. Oh, that's very rich. Yes. Yeah. And so
I call it the laws of physics. When the laws of physics are reinforced, I just kind of feel a little more confident in the law. We're supposed to suffer when we don't keep relationship agreements. Yes. It's not supposed to be make our life better because we don't keep our relationship agreement. I mean, life isn't supposed to be that way.
That's a good point.
So when men are having consequences for not keeping their relationship agreement, and they say, and the way they tell me they have a consequence is they feel out of control, it's like, okay, good, you're in the right place.
Yeah, and what I was bringing up earlier is how the media really makes it more about where the sex addiction model comes in plays, where if you broke that agreement, then their scapegoat is sex addiction.
I have a little more empathy for society here. I think it's the only way they know how to talk about it. If you only give people kindergarten words to talk about complex ideas, then they'll use their kindergarten word.
Yeah.
And sex addiction is a kindergarten word.
It's also a safe word for them.
Well, it avoids the kind of detail. Like, look, I asked Darwin what stuff meant, right? And Darwin had some great, he knew exactly what he was thinking, at least when I asked him, right? So when somebody tells me they're a sex addict, I ask them, well, what do you want me to know about you? What do you want? What should I know about you when you tell me that?
Right.
It's like going to a 4-year-old and say, use your words, don't just point.
Right. Oh, amazing. So simple.
Well, I don't know if it's so simple, but I think it because I don't think a lot of people know how to do this.
Well, it's simple.
When people hear sex addict, they just get overwhelmed with judgment or aggressiveness, or they're in a state of fury at somebody, or they're making judgments about their sex acts, or they're against their God or religion. And so the sex addict is a phrase that has so many purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think what you were bringing up earlier, it's just, when we talk about just behavior in general, it might, if it doesn't fall in line with what society says is acceptable, then it falls under the sex addiction model, right? So
yes, that's the way society knows how to talk about it.
Exactly. So that's kind of what I mean by why it's a simple out, right? So
I see.
Yeah. But yeah, and then, so we can talk about, how the sexual diversity, right? And how, how do we normalize, if you will, sexual behavior that conflicts with what society says is.
This is the third part of out of control sexual behavior.
Yeah.
So remember I said there were 3 things,
Yes.
Being dysregulated or your relationship conflict. And the third one is having erotic conflict. Yes. In other words, something that really excites you, something that gives you enormous pleasure, is disapproved of, is judged a sin, is seen as pathological or disgusting, or is repudiated, or you are shamed for it. And, when you have something that is a source of enormous erotic pleasure, and if it's known, you will be shunned. We tend to not talk about those erotic pleasures because shunning is really tough.
Right. So you avoid.
And so oftentimes people with these erotic conflicts have avoided being honest and open about what erotically turns them on. And of course, that means they're keeping it a secret or it's hidden, and we tend to not regulate parts of our lives that we feel ashamed of and hide. But that's not a great formula for being a good regulator.
Yeah, I mean, what, as a sexual health coach, one of the components that it's like on my homepage as part of my services is I help with discovering your erotic identity, because we all have one, right?
Yeah.
It's a matter of, affirming that and accepting and embracing that part of your identity.
Can I add one more thing to your
Yes.
because I feel so strongly about this. Developing your erotic identity can also mean loss of important attachment.
Yeah.
You could lose your attachment to God in some circles if you accept certain erotic identities. You can lose attachment to family. You can lose attachment to your church. You can lose attachment to your religious community. You can lose attachment to your faith. That's a devoutly felt and an essential part of one's identity. There's a lot of losses that can go along with acceptance of erotic identity. This is very real in America.
Yeah.
So I guess I want to give the picture that facing one's erotic identity development is exuberant and can be lovely when it's accepted and we can kind of integrate it in a way. But it's important to acknowledge that journey for many people involves loss.
Right. That's a great point that you bring up. Yeah, absolutely. And
well, let me give an example of that. That'll be a personal example.
Sure.
The first moments of my life when I was in my very early 20s, and I realized absolutely, certainly, that I was attracted to men, not women. I knew that I was a gay man. When I knew it, the first thought that went through my mind, this was in the 1979.
Say it.
Can you believe people were alive then? But in 19.
I was.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Thank you. But when I had that thought, the first thing that went through my mind, I'll never have children. I'll never have the wedding that my siblings had. The minute I understood an important part of my identity, loss came in. Wow. It's part of the package.
So it's interesting. I had the opposite experience. When I got a taste of my erotic identity, for me, it was like an awakening. Mm-hmm. I felt very liberated, and I was happy to rid myself of the unhealthy attachments I had to sexuality and sexual health.
So there's your loss. You got to lose some things you had no quandary about losing.
Yes,
but it was lost.
It was lost, just in a positive way.
But yes. it was a liberating loss.
Yes, so you're right.
But it's a loss. It's an ending. It's a doing away with. Sometimes losses are liberating, and sometimes losses are painful. But it's loss.
It's true. Wow, I just learned. Look at that. I love it. So we've talked about out of control sexual behavior. I'm curious, in your work that you've been working primarily with men. I'm curious as to, does it affect more of men than women, or, kind of?
You mentioned the research is primarily on men. So has there been a lot of research on women?
Very little. I'll give a shout out to a therapist in the Bay Area in Oakland who's kind of really taken a leadership in understanding women, people who live in female identified bodies and their experience of possibly feeling sexually out of control. And she's really taken kind of a lead in trying to understand this. She's created a whole salon of people who got together and talked about this and looked at the research. They did a really interesting thing. Every month they met and would go through a chapter of the book, Treating Out of Control Sexual Behavior, Rethinking Sex Addiction, and they'd read it all together like a book reading club. And then they'd go through and think about which things applied, they thought, to women and which things didn't. And through that whole discussion, they ended up with one additional narrative in addition to erotic conflict and relationship attachment ruptures and difficulty regulating. They come up with a fourth one that they think is relevant to people who live in the world in female bodies and female identified bodies. And that is they live with and have to endure the experiences of sexism and misogyny and patriarchy in a way that male identified people don't have to experience in quite the same way. And that some women's reactions to living with those influences in the world can create conflicts that feel sexually out of control.
What was the researcher's name? What is
Oh,
her?
Jess Levitt, Jessica Levitt, Levith. If you just Google Jessica Levitt, sex therapist, you'll get her information. And Jess is just, she's one of these people that is doing for this area and thoughtful thinking around the sexual health model as well, around women feeling sexually out of control, in much the same way I was doing 30 years ago. So I just think the world of her.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad to see that there's research being done around the model for women. I'm wondering, do you see out of control sexual behavior like with younger generations at all, or is this really just with adults?
Yeah, is it specific to certain age groups, or do you see more in certain age groups?
Yeah, see, this model was developed with adult cis men, so that's all I can speak to.
Okay.
We certainly know that youth need help with sexual health and the principles of sexual health. Here's just one example of the 6 principles of sexual health. There's an association called the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network, NCTSN, and they have they're funded by the federal government, and they're very interested in the different traumatic experiences children go through. And one of the things they began to realize through different conversations with me and other people in the room, my partner as well, Harvey, that we don't address the sexual health of children until after they've been injured.
Right.
And so children who've been sexually abused or have been through neglect or violence or sexual exploitation or whatever it may be, then these children get access to sexual health conversations. But children don't get access to this stuff unless they've been hurt. And the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network is very interested in advocating for the sexual health of children that without them having to be violated and a victim of a crime before they have access to this information. And so they have a fact sheet that's free and online, and you can look it up, the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network fact sheet on sexual health. If you put that in Google keyword, you'll get a PDF of the document. And it's a 3-page document that's all about advocating for the sexual health of people.
And it goes back to, in the start of our conversation, have the importance of comprehensive and inclusive sexual health education.
Right.
Yeah.
Medically accurate.
Medically accurate. And I will even take it a step further, being taught by sexuality educators and not physical health coaches, with all due respect. I just think that there's more to the education that is, that needs to be provided. And I think we need somebody who is
we don't
trained
have
in
English.
that field.
We don't have English lit majors teaching physics.
Exactly. So why do we treat sexual health any different, right? So,
well, I can tell you why, because we don't live in a country that values the sexual literacy of its population.
Yeah, it's interesting. Darwin and we watched a video recently about how there was a woman from Germany, a college student from Germany, and who came to school in the States, and just her experience with sexuality and sexual health education, and just how taboo everything and controversial was over here versus back home. Everything was just laid out from the time that they were little, and it was hard for her to understand. Doran, do you remember the video I'm talking about?
That's actually, I think, the video where we first learned about what he was mentioning, the medically accurate sex education. I think it was in that video where she mentioned it.
Yeah,
and
that's
I
their
had never heard
approach.
of that, and it completely just shocked me.
Yeah.
Well,
And
there's a reason you've never heard of it. It's the federal government is not interested in this being a well-known fact.
well, and it's just not just about medically accurate, but it's also about relevant information, right? So we can look
Right.
at the data, and the data speaks for itself, right? So it doesn't matter morals, it doesn't matter, what we would like happen, but what we do know is what we're doing isn't working, and it's not supporting our youth. It's not giving them the tools and the knowledge that they need to make healthy, responsible decisions, good choices for themselves.
However, though, it's working quite effectively from the perspective of the actual major motive in our country for sex education in our country.
Which
Because
is
the motive for sex education in our country is to delay the sexual debut until someone's married.
right, but that's not working.
Well, what your motive is and whether it works are two different things. The motive for sex education in our country has not changed to
Correct.
much degree at all, which is the real issue is to make sure when a pregnancy happens, it happens in the context of a heterosexual marriage.
Correct.
That's a huge motive for sex education in this country. And anything that would deflect the possibility of that outcome, many people are not invested in that education happening.
Right.
Where you have your sexual debut and who you have it with and under what circumstances is the central issue for sex education in our country. That's really what people care about.
Interesting.
So we really focus on sexual health, but we hear a lot of the language around unhealthy versus healthy sexuality. Can you share a little bit expand a little bit about that?
Yeah, you won't hear me say that word, healthy or unhealthy sexuality.
Right.
Notice I haven't said that word once.
Yes.
I just say sexual health. Now, the reason for that is healthy and unhealthy sexuality is a binary concept. In other words, you only have two sides to be on. Is that healthy or is it unhealthy? And, the binary way of addressing and understanding sexual health is not a helpful notion because it's not that simple. It's not just one or the other. Sexuality is complex and human and value driven and culturally informed and, family relationships and religion and race and economics. And it's just so complex. So to draw up this arbitrary list of that's healthy and this is unhealthy tends to be informed by the colonizers, the Northern European colonizers of the North American continent, tend to be the ones drawing up that list. And if you're off the Northern European white colonizers, that list doesn't have much relevance to you as to what's unhealthy or not. So, binaries also tend to be controlled by the dominant power in culture. And so it leaves out a lot of people. So that's why I use sexual health, because sexual health is a set of principles. These are ideas, not sex acts.
Right. Which goes back to what Darwin was brought up with.
Right. Oftentimes people. Right. But when people think about what's healthy or unhealthy, they're thinking about a specific sexual activity or a sex act or a context in which sex might occur. It's very act driven. It's very, observable behavior of a specific sexual activity. That's what people think of when they think of healthy or unhealthy sex. Whereas sexual health are concepts that you have to learn to understand throughout the entire course of your lifetime. We're always having to figure out consent. We're always having to figure out whether I'm being exploited or not. We're always having to judge ourselves as to how honest or dishonest I want to be in a situation. We're always trying to figure out what our values might be in this situation. Is this going to possibly risk a pregnancy? Is this pleasurable? These are always in the conversation with our sexual health. They're always there, no matter what body part goes in which orifice with whom.
Right. And I appreciate earlier you referenced, you said it was a destination. Right.
Yes.
And, I remember all through graduate school, I always, in all my conversations, my class discussions, I would always bring sexual health as part of the conversation. And my biggest thing is treating sexual health like it's part of your general health. When you just see sexual health as just part of your general health, then you can apply these principles in a very logical and very matter of fact manner. So I appreciate the destination component that
I really want to reinforce your wisdom there, Sharon, in sort of linking sexual health with overall health and well-being. This is a mission of the World Health Organization. This is a mission of one of the major health, idea thinkers on the planet. When they think about global health, having sexual health be on the same level of importance with mental health and physical health and spiritual or existential health, but they're all important.
Well, they're all connected.
They're all
right?
connected.
They're all
yes,
connected.
They're all connected. That's right. They're all connected. And so so an example of that is, a third of all health problems for reproductive age women on the planet, 1/3 of every single one of their health problems is related to sexual health in reproductive aged women. So we're not talking about a small detail of their overall health. Right. So we have statistics to support this notion, Sharon, that you're so good at advocating for. So keep at it. This is such an important message for people to understand.
Well, I appreciate that. I do. Well, since a lot of what I focus on is also intimacy, I'm wondering, how does out of control sexual behavior, which, by the way, I will add that what you've taught me also in the training is to always completely spell it out. Don't use initials, right, or abbreviations. Like, you say what it is. So, so out of control sexual behavior, how does that affect intimacy? Can someone still feel or experience out of control sexual behavior and still experience intimacy?
Well, here's my idea of intimacy. It's being vulnerable and telling people who you are. Now, that's not always good news.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're vulnerable and tell some people who we are, and we don't have good news to tell them about who we are. Now, do we consider that intimacy and closeness?
Well, vulnerability is intimacy, right?
Right. And a lot of the times, vulnerability is telling you something that you wouldn't know about me unless I told you.
Right.
So how this relates to out of control sexual behavior is one of the basic fundamental breaches of relationships in people with out of control sexual behavior is they don't keep their sexual relationship agreement. You just don't have out of control sexual behavior in a relation if you're in a relationship without breaking those agreements.
Right.
So the issue here is not so much about intimacy as like a broader concept. I'm going to call it vulnerability. Are you willing to be vulnerable and tell your partner that you didn't keep an agreement?
Right. Oh, that's powerful.
That's the central issue. Now, how this happens in out of control sexual behavior therapy is we don't ask men to bring that level of vulnerability to their relationships at the beginning of therapy. We just ask them to have that kind of vulnerability with me and a group of men they're in therapy with. Let's start there. Let's practice vulnerability and see how somebody can get better at being vulnerable. It's sort of like spring training before you go to the baseball season. People need to warm up to doing difficult things. And the warm up is coming to these group therapies that I run and other therapists do around the country for men with feeling sexually out of control, where the agreement is they have a sexual health plan. And on their sexual health plan, they have certain boundaries of things they don't want to no longer engage in. And the only agreement we have in group, that's the central agreement, is that if you cross the boundary on your sexual health plan, you come to group and tell the group the next week. Now, do you think all the men do that? No. If all the men who came to the group could the very next week say, "Oh, I crossed the boundary on my sexual health plan. I crossed the boundary on my sexual," and they could all do it universally, perfectly, they wouldn't need to be in the group.
Right.
Because they're going to not keep that agreement, which is to tell us that you crossed the boundary. They're not going to keep that agreement.
Right.
And then they're going to eventually tell us, or it'll be found out. And then we get to find out, why didn't you keep the agreement? All the therapy is figuring out why they didn't keep the agreement. There's reasons people don't keep agreements. They just don't like talking about it.
Right. Well, I think it brings us to the next point is just what are some treatment options? Well, first, before we talk about treatment options, I guess, if someone's feeling out of control or is experiencing out of control sexual behavior, what are some of the things that they can do to start the process of changing that behavior?
Well, if they're listening to this podcast, bravo. But let's give them credit for that.
Yeah,
right?
bravo.
They've already.
Yes.
Really, this is where I start with men, because men will always say what I can do, and if they're talking to me and asking them what they can do, they've done something. Because how do they find me, right? So if they're listening to you, how do they find you? Something got them to listen to this podcast. Who is that? What part of themselves? And they've endured this podcast for however many minutes, so why are they staying to listen? Why are they interested in this conversation? Who is that part of themselves that's interested in this conversation? I'd like them to see if they can figure out who that is. Which part of themselves really cares about their sexual health?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next thing I'd have them do is these 6 principles. All you have to do is, the 6 principles of sexual health are now so pervasive. I'm really proud of this. I mean, this is an idea I came up with maybe 20 or more years ago. And now if you Google the 6 principles of sexual health, you'll get like 7 pages or more of all sorts of things about the 6 principles of sexual health. So this is not hard to find. Just Google it, 6
Mm-hmm.
principles of sexual health, and you'll get all sorts of stuff. Well, pick a podcast, learn some more, or read an article about it, and then just sort of think about, gee, what's my history with consent and non-consent in my sexual life? When have I been exploited? Let's start there. Not when have I been exploited. Everybody loves to talk about when they've been exploited.
Mm-hmm.
I'm much more interested in men talking about when have I been exploited. That's a much more
Mm-hmm.
important conversation. Where am I at with honesty in my sexual life? Have I had unplanned and unwanted pregnancies in my life? How many STIs have I had? How many times have I been worried that I had an STI? How many times have I been worried that somebody had a pregnancy we didn't want to have happen? Have I ever had a concern about HIV? Do I do things to protect myself from getting HIV? I mean, this is the work.
Yeah.
And then somebody could say, well, what gives me pleasure? Why am I watching that video? What's the thing I really enjoy?
Right. And changing, I think a big part of that is also changing the relationship with sexual imagery.
Yeah. So what when you said change the relationship with, sexual imagery, what were you thinking? What is the kind, because you got to thought.
Right. So meaning that it can be an accepting part of your sexuality is to use sexual imagery as part of your sexual engagement or your sexual activity.
Or pleasure.
Thank you. I was searching for the word, and for it not to be shaming, right?
So Sharon, this is why I wanted you to describe more what you meant by that sentence, because somebody listening could have thought you meant something completely different.
Yeah.
Change your relationship to sex. Somebody listening, if you hadn't said what you meant by that, could have thought, that's damn right. You better stop watching.
Right.
Right. So
actually,
you see,
that's what I was thinking her point was as well, actually.
Okay, right. So we have an N of one to prove my point. So I'm wanting you to see how important it is. How important it is to ask.
Yes.
Tell me what you meant by that.
Right.
So that because look at, if Darwin had that thought, how many other listeners could have had that thought? And they could have left the podcast going, oh my God, I guess the way to work with sexual imagery in life is you better stop watching. And they could have thought they heard it right.
Right. Right. Oh,
Excellent point.
Excellent point. Well, and then just to my point, as far as even just using, I'll just bring up some of the points regarding how language matters, sexual imagery versus porn, sexual health versus unhealthy or healthy sex or sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about sexual agreements versus cheating or an affair. What was the other one? There was one more we talked about. Masturbation, self-pleasure, right? So all of these, how language,
or solo sex.
Or solo sex, right? Solo sex. You want to share a little bit about
partner sex and solo sex?
Yes.
There's 2 ways to have it. Either there's one or more persons in the room, or just you.
Yes. And how okay that is, right? How okay that is. So
well, yeah, and then yeah, exactly. Because for some people that's fine, and for other people it means they're going to go to hell and never see their relatives in the afterlife.
Exactly. And I think what I got out of the approach of out of control sexual behavior, especially when you talk about one's lived experience and personal feeling and the way they feel in their own bodies, right? That their own experience.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
that is the takeaway, that it's not anybody else's opinion or society's views or values or beliefs. It's your feeling with regards to your sexuality and your sexual behavior.
As long as this is the only agreement I ask of people,
Yeah.
is it in alignment with the 6 principles of sexual?
Yes.
Because people will have feelings that are not in alignment with the 6 principles
Right.
of sexual health, or they'll have urges that are not in alignment with the 6 principles, or they'll have thoughts that are not in alignment, or they may experience pleasure, very intense sexual pleasure that is a violation of one of the principles of sexual health, and
Yes.
and they have to figure that out.
Right. And thank you for bringing that up. Yes, that is that is a must as part.
Well, it's not a must, because a lot of people could care less about the principles and they do all sorts of things. I mean, we wouldn't have all these violations of sexual health if people either didn't know about it, or that's not a big investment of theirs to go by these principles. But it's what I call it is an agreement. It's the one agreement I ask of people who would want help from me, or would want help in their feeling sexually out of control. The only, do you aspire to, would you like your life to be aligned with the 6 principles of sexual health? Does that have value and meaning to you? Because that's the goal of changing out of control sexual behavior, is to have it align with the 6 principles. Because my belief is, the more you align your life with the 6 principles of sexual health, it's incompatible with feeling out of control. You can't do both.
Mm-hmm. One of the quotes that stood out for me in your book, that it said, therapeutic opportunities for clients and clinicians with regards to out of control sexual behavior that liberate them from establishing a sexual behavior disorder and empowers them to discover new solutions to their sexual health problems.
Yeah, what you're reminding us is that a sexual health way of changing one's out of control sexual behavior does not require them to have a diagnosis,
yes,
or a mental illness, or a psychiatric disorder, or an addictive disorder. There's no requirement for a medical or psychiatric diagnosis to be eligible for saying I feel sexually out of control. It's just an experience someone's having in the world, and we need to find out how much they're feeling out of control is correlated with the fact that they're not in alignment with one or more of the principles of sexual health. Mm-hmm. And if we can have men learn that a significant factor in you feeling sexually out of control is that your behavior is not aligned with the kind of human behavior that when people behave that way, they feel in control of their sexual life. There's a reason for feeling out of control. It's not a disorder. It's not a pathology. Because you're not going along with sexual health principles.
Right. Well, I think that is a good close for this conversation. What do you think?
I think that's a perfect close.
Yes.
If where can people learn more about you and what you do and your teaching? And
well, the easiest thing is to go to the web, and it's the Harvey Institute, all one word, the HarveyInstitute.com. And that's where my web presence is. On my website are all sorts of links to podcasts, which yours will be on there when it airs, as well as articles and papers that I've written, the 3 books that I've written. You can also see where in-person trainings are happening. If a professional who's interested in learning more about out of control sexual behavior is listening, there are also training opportunities. I have a video lecture series based on the book Treating Out of Control Sexual Behavior, Rethinking Sexual Addiction, that somebody can, they're just 10-minute videos. There's 30 of them. That is a comprehensive kind of overview of the book that's different than, and it has a case application, and it goes over many things in the book, but it's a listening way specifically rather than reading the whole book. And I also have a 10-part series of demonstrating the screening, assessment, and individual therapy methods of out of control sexual behavior. It's a 10-part series. Each one is a full psychotherapy session with an actor who was a client who was in session with me for 10 sessions in his character. And I never knew his name other than his character's name. I never spoke with him in a single sentence before we recorded these 10 sessions, unless he was in his role as a client. I didn't even know his real name until we'd done the recording all 10 sessions.
Oh, wow.
He was a client in my mind. But the ethics was I wanted an actor for these videotape recordings to teach and train rather than an actual client. I just didn't feel comfortable with that. So he did a fabulous job. And so that's a resource for therapists as well. So, I've been trying to create different ways for people to have access to sexual health information through education and training for professionals. And I'm right now in the process of writing my next book, which is a book for the general public on feeling sexually out of control for, just anybody who might feel this way without having to be in therapy, without having to go through a series of psychotherapy treatment methods. There's a way you can, feel more sexually in control without having to go through psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Not everybody needs that level of care to feel more sexually in control by aligning their life with principles of sexual health. And that's what that book will help people do.
Well, I am beyond grateful for you sharing your time with me and with us.
Was this a good debut for you, Sharon?
Oh my God, this was a great first. This was a great first experience. Are you kidding me? You talk about an awakening. Yeah.
But isn't it lovely at our age in life, we get to say we had a debut and it was enjoyable?
I mean, seriously, yes.
It
was pleasurable.
And it was pleasurable.
It was pleasurable.
Youth have spent having debuts that we try to rework the rest of our lives.
Right. No, I'm so grateful to you. Thank you so much.
It was really nice. The combination was really nice as well. That's what I wanted to do.
Hey there. Thanks for checking out this episode. If you'd like to connect with Doug for trainings and workshops, or to learn more about his work with out-of-control sexual behavior, visit his website at theharveyinstitute.com. Doug is also a panelist on the podcast Rethinking Porn Addiction, which you can find on YouTube. If you want to learn more about how to improve your sexual health, or if you're interested in my sexual health coaching services, you can visit my website, SharonWindham.com, SharonWindham.com, or you can follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Sex Health with Sharon. And remember to follow the 6 principles of sexual health: consent, non-exploitation, protection from STIs and unintended pregnancy, honesty, shared values, and mutual pleasure. Remember that sexual health is the balance between safety and sexual pleasure while ensuring your sexual rights. So until next time.